The gym was nearly deserted that evening, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above the rows of silent machines. Alex, a 22-year-old student, had just finished his workout. His arms trembled with fatigue, and beads of sweat slid down his face as he carried his bag toward the locker room. For him, this place had become more than a gym. It was an escape from endless lectures, assignments, and the invisible weight of expectations pressing on his shoulders. And part of that escape had always been tied to Chris. Chris was older, more experienced, someone who had seen Alex struggle from the very first day and offered encouragement when no one else had noticed. Over time, Alex had come to rely on his presence. Chris was a friend, a mentor, the steady figure who seemed to carry confidence with him everywhere. But tonight, something was different, something subtle in the air, like the quiet before a storm. The locker room was nearly silent, except for the drip of a shower in the corner and the echo of Alex's sneakers against the tiled floor. He opened his locker, pulling out a towel, his mind already drifting toward the relief of hot water washing away the ache in his muscles. Everything felt normal until he sensed movement behind him. He turned slightly, and there was Chris leaning against the lockers, his expression unreadable. Chris's gaze lingered longer than usual, and Alex felt his pulse quicken without knowing why. There was no grin, no casual remark about the workout, none of the easy banter they usually shared. Instead, Chris stood still, his shoulders tense, his jaw set, as though wrestling with something he could no longer contain. Alex tried to ignore the shift in atmosphere, muttering a quick, "See you tomorrow," before heading toward the showers. Steam was already clouding the air as Alex stepped into one of the stalls. The water roared to life, drowning out the lingering silence of the locker room. He closed his eyes, letting the heat soak into his skin, convincing himself that whatever tension had passed between them was nothing, just exhaustion from a long day. But before he could settle into that thought, he heard the faint creak of the shower room door. Footsteps echoed against the tiles. Steady, deliberate, closer. Alex's chest tightened. He opened his eyes, confused, and then froze. Chris was standing there, not outside the stalls, not keeping the invisible line of privacy they had always respected, but right in front of him. Chris had stepped inside, his presence filling the small space in a way that made the air feel heavier, tighter. For a moment, neither spoke. Alex's mind raced. This wasn't a joke, wasn't some casual mistake. Chris had chosen this. He had crossed into a space that was private, vulnerable, and now there was no mistaking the intention behind it. The sound of rushing water couldn't drown out the silence pressing between them. Chris's eyes locked on Alex's, steady, unwavering. He didn't smirk, didn't laugh. His voice, when it finally came, was low, calm, and deliberate. "Let's shower together." The words landed with the force of a confession, sharp and unavoidable. Alex's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the words themselves that shook him. It was the way they were spoken. No hesitation, no trace of humor. Just raw, unsettling honesty. Alex's mind scrambled for explanations. Was this a test? A provocation? A joke taken too far? But nothing in Chris's face hinted at playfulness. His expression was steady, controlled, and yet his eyes betrayed something deeper, a battle barely hidden beneath the surface. The water pounded around them, but Alex could hear his own heartbeat louder. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the stall, unsure whether to move, to speak, or to simply stand frozen in disbelief. Kristen stepped closer, but he didn't retreat either. He held his ground, as though waiting for Alex to give an answer, to break the unbearable tension. Every second stretched into eternity. Alex's thoughts tangled, months of friendship, every conversation, every shared laugh flashing back with a new, disorienting meaning. Had there always been something more behind Chris's words, behind the way he looked at him sometimes when he thought no one noticed? Alex tried to find his voice, but nothing came. The weight of the moment pressed down, suffocating in its intensity. He could see the faint tremor in Chris's hands, the way his shoulders rose and fell with controlled breaths, as if he had carried this secret for too long and could no longer keep it buried. "Let's shower together." The words echoed again in Alex's mind, circling, colliding, demanding attention. They weren't casual. They weren't ordinary. From Chris, in this space, they meant something else entirely, a step across a line that could never be erased. Alex's chest burned with conflicting emotions, confusion, fear, curiosity, even a flicker of something he couldn't name. He wanted to speak, to ask why now, why here, why in this way. But the words refused to form. All he could do was stand there, caught between the rushing water and the weight of a sentence that had rewritten everything he thought he knew. Chris didn't move, didn't add anything. His silence was heavier than the phrase itself. He simply stood there, waiting, holding Alex's gaze with an intensity that left no escape. The moment stretched on, fragile and volatile, a single thread away from unraveling everything. And in that instant, Alex realized nothing would ever be the same again. The hours after that night moved strangely for Alex, as if the world had shifted slightly off its axis. The words Chris had spoken in the shower echoed endlessly in his head, circling until they lost all shape and became pure weight pressing on his chest. He tried to tell himself it didn't mean what it sounded like, that perhaps it was only a slip, a poorly timed attempt at humor, something that could be brushed off like the clatter of a dropped dumbbell. Yet every time he replayed the moment, every detail contradicted that easy excuse. The way Chris had looked at him, steady and unflinching, the deliberate tone, the absence of a smile. None of it fit the category of a joke. And so Alex carried the words with him, dragging them from one day into the next, waiting for a sign of what they truly meant. But when he returned to the gym the following evening, Chris wasn't there. The familiar rhythm of their routine, spotting each other, trading remarks between sets, was absent, replaced by a silence that made the cavernous weight room feel colder than usual. Alex went through his exercises mechanically, glancing toward the entrance every few minutes, expecting to see Chris stride in with that effortless confidence that once seemed unshakable. Yet the doorway remained empty, the machines too quiet, the energy of the space strangely hollow. At first, Alex tried to convince himself it was coincidence. People miss days. Schedules change. Nothing unusual. But the second day passed, then the third, and still no sign of Chris. When he finally appeared again, Alex felt a surge of relief that froze almost instantly into confusion. Chris was there, but not really. Headphones clamped tightly over his ears, eyes locked on the floor. He moved from machine to machine with surgical detachment, as if determined to avoid even a single glance in Alex's direction. When Alex lifted a hand in a hesitant greeting, Chris returned only the smallest nod, his expression unreadable, before turning away. The distance between them grew like a shadow stretching across the floor. Alex told himself he would wait it out, give Chris space, let him come back when ready. But days became weeks, and the silence refused to break. Messages went unanswered. "Good session tonight," Alex texted once, staring at the glowing screen until the words felt pathetic. No reply. "Want to grab a shake later?" he typed another time, deleting the message before his thumb could betray his doubt. 3 more half-written notes followed, each abandoned, each swallowed by the same gnawing fear that the connection between them had been severed at the root. The gym, once a place of comfort, now felt hostile, every corner filled with the echo of what had been lost. Alex could almost feel Chris's absence, even when he was there, as though the older man had built invisible walls around himself. Alex noticed the way Chris kept to the far end of the room, how he packed up quickly, avoiding conversation, slipping out before Alex could close the distance. It was avoidance so sharp it cut, sharper than any words could have been. One evening, unable to bear it any longer, Alex walked to Chris's locker, heart thudding as though approaching a door he had no right to open. He knocked softly, the metal reverberating like a drum. For a long moment, nothing. Then the faint creak as the door shifted just enough for a sliver of Chris's face to appear, eyes shadowed, expression tight. "Not tonight," he muttered, voice low and final, before slamming the door shut. The sound echoed down the row of lockers, a punctuation mark that left Alex stunned in its violence. He stood there, staring at the dented surface, his chest aching, his mind struggling to process the sheer finality of the dismissal. That night, Alex couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the silence in his room as suffocating as the silence in the gym. He replayed every word, every look, searching for meaning in fragments that refused to align. And just as the clock pushed past 1 in the morning, he heard it, faint footsteps outside his door. He sat up, pulse racing, waiting for the inevitable knock. But none came, only silence, thick and unnerving. He rose cautiously, hand hovering over the doorknob, and when he finally opened it, the hallway was empty. At his feet lay a small folded piece of paper, his name scrawled across the front in hurried handwriting. His fingers trembled as he picked it up, unfolding it with the same care as though it might shatter in his hands. 2 words stare back at him. "I'm sorry." That was all. No explanation, no context, no signature needed. Alex stared at the note until the letters blurred, reading it again and again, as if repetition might unlock the secret behind its brevity. Sorry for what? Sorry for stepping into the shower? Sorry for speaking words that couldn't be unsaid? Sorry for walking away, for the silence, for the wall, now standing between them? The note provided no answers, only more questions, its simplicity a knife twisting in the space where clarity should have been. Alex pressed the paper flat against his palm, feeling the indentation of the ink like a scar. It was not closure, not even an opening, but a reminder that whatever had happened was real, that it mattered enough for Chris to acknowledge, if only with 2 impossible words. Alex slipped the note into his pocket, unable to throw it away, unwilling to let it go. It burned there like a hidden truth, a weight he couldn't escape, and as he lay back down, staring into the darkness, one thought pulsed louder than the silence. This was far from over. When Alex finally saw him again, it was late in the evening, the gym nearly empty, the air heavy with the dull hum of fluorescent lights and the faint metallic scent of weights that had been abandoned hours earlier. Chris was sitting alone on the edge of a bench, shoulders slumped, his hoodie pulled low over his face. For a moment, Alex thought about turning back, about sparing himself another rejection. But something about the way Chris sat there, motionless, head bowed, hands dangling uselessly between his knees, froze him to the spot. The confident figure he had always known looked diminished, almost unrecognizable, as if the weight he carried inside had finally crushed him down into something fragile. Alex approached slowly, uncertain whether he was walking into another wall of silence. When Chris lifted his eyes, there was no trace of the grin that once lit up the gym, no mask of casual charm. Instead, his gaze was raw, lined with exhaustion. The air between them stretched tight, filled with all the unspoken things that had hung there for weeks. Finally, Chris broke the silence, his voice low, cracked at the edges. "I can't keep doing this." The words hung heavy, not quite an explanation, not quite a plea, but something caught between the two. Alex said nothing, waiting, almost afraid that any interruption would shatter the fragile moment. Chris exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, the motion restless, desperate. "Pretending it's nothing. Pretending I'm nothing." The bitterness in his voice startled Alex. He had never heard Chris sound so stripped of control. Then, in halting words, Chris began to unravel. He spoke about years of living behind a mask, years of smiling when he wanted to disappear, of nodding along with expectations he never believed in, of building relationships that were hollow from the start. "I've spent my whole life being what people wanted me to be," he said, his fists clenching tight as if holding on to the performance even as it slipped away. The son who never argued, the friend who never slipped, the boyfriend who played the role. And every time I did it, it killed a little more of me. His voice shook, but he forced himself to keep speaking, as though the confession was a dam bursting open and there was no stopping it now. "I thought I could handle it," he admitted. "If I kept the mask on, if I smiled enough, if I kept everyone else happy, then maybe I'd be safe. Maybe I could survive like that. He shook his head, laughing bitterly at his own words. But then I met you, and you looked at me like I wasn't a lie, like I was someone real. Do you know what that does to a person who's been pretending their whole life? His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked away quickly, ashamed of the tremor that betrayed him. Alex's chest tightened. He had imagined explanations for Chris's distance, excuses that made sense in fragments. But hearing the truth laid bare like this was heavier than anything he had prepared for. He searched for something to say, but Chris pressed on, his words tumbling out faster, sharper. I don't know who I am when I'm around you, and that terrifies me. Because with you, I can't hide. I can't fall back on the smile or the role. You strip all of that away just by existing, and I don't know if I can survive without the mask. I don't know if I know how. His hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. His eyes were fixed on the floor, as if he couldn't bear to see the reaction his words might bring. For a long moment, Alex stood frozen, torn between the instinct to comfort him and the knowledge that Chris was fighting something no reassurance could easily fix. The silence between them grew sharp, almost unbearable, filled with the weight of the confession and the fear it carried. Finally, Alex moved closer, his presence steady though his thoughts raced. He wanted to tell Chris that he didn't have to perform anymore, that he didn't need to keep building walls that only hurt him. But the words caught in his throat, trapped by the intensity of the moment. Instead, he let the silence speak, allowing Chris's honesty to hang between them without judgment. Chris's shoulders trembled as if he were holding back something deeper, something he wasn't ready to release. He swallowed hard, his eyes flickering up for only a second before darting away again. Do you know what it feels like to live every day knowing that the people closest to you don't really know you? That they'd rather believe in the version of you they invented than the truth? It's suffocating. It's like drowning while everyone around you thinks you're fine. His voice broke, and the sound of it carved into Alex's chest. The fluorescent lights hummed on, indifferent to the storm unraveling beneath them. Chris sat hunched forward, fists pressed against his knees, the raw edges of his confession leaving the space between them heavy with unanswered questions. Alex still couldn't find the words, but maybe silence was enough, at least for now. Chris had finally said aloud what he had buried for years, and the air around them seemed forever changed. For the first time, the mask was gone, and what remained was messy, vulnerable, terrifyingly real. And though the silence lingered, stretching between them like a fragile thread, Alex knew one truth with absolute certainty. This was only the beginning of a fight far larger than either of them had ever imagined. The gym felt impossibly quiet that night, as though even the walls were listening. Chris sat hunched forward, his elbows pressed into his knees, his entire body shaking with the strain of words he had never let himself say. Alex stood nearby, close enough to hear every uneven breath, yet careful not to push. He could sense the tension in the air, that fragile moment when someone is balanced on the edge of collapse and confession, when silence feels as sharp as a blade. Chris lifted his head at last, his face pale with exhaustion, his eyes rimmed with a rawness that could not be hidden anymore. "I can't keep this up," he said, his voice trembling but louder than before, louder than the hum of the lights and the creak of the empty machines. "I can't keep pretending I'm someone I'm not." The words tumbled out with the weight of finality, like chains breaking after years of carrying them. Alex felt his breath catch, the force of the admission hitting him harder than any physical blow. Chris's voice cracked as he continued, his hands clenching in a fist that trembled despite his effort to appear strong. "Do you know what it's like to live every single day as a lie? To smile when inside you're screaming? To stand in front of people who claim they love you, knowing they only love the mask you wear? I've been doing it for so long, I don't even know where the act ends and I begin." He swallowed hard, his chest heaving. "I can't do it anymore. I won't." The silence that followed was thick, almost unbearable. Alex's instinct was to step in, to soothe, to reassure, but he resisted. Something told him that Chris didn't need quick comfort or easy answers. What he needed was space to stand in his own truth, even if that truth came jagged and heavy. So Alex stayed still, his eyes steady, his posture open, letting Chris know without words that he wasn't alone. Chris looked at him with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as though testing whether the admission would be met with judgment or abandonment. "If I stop pretending," he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of the question, "what's left of me? Who am I then?" Alex didn't flinch. He didn't offer solutions, didn't try to mold the moment into something softer. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, his presence itself an answer. Slowly, he sat down opposite Chris, close enough for him to feel that he wasn't speaking into emptiness. Chris's eyes darted away, his jaw tight as if bracing for rejection. Yet Alex remained, steady and patient, refusing to move. That patience cracked something inside Chris. His breathing grew uneven, the words spilling out as though they had been caged too long. "I've been terrified my whole life," he admitted, his voice ragged. "Terrified of what my family would say, terrified of what people would think, terrified of being exposed for who I really am. So I buried it. I built walls. I let everyone believe the story they wanted, because it was easier than facing the truth." His gaze flicked up, catching Alex's for only a second before falling again. "But then you showed up, and you didn't buy the mask. You saw me, and I can't hide from that. I don't want to, but I don't know how not to." Alex's chest tightened at the confession, the sheer vulnerability cutting through the layers of strength Chris usually carried. He still didn't speak, still didn't press, because he knew the power of being heard without interruption. His silence wasn't distance. It was trust, an invitation for Chris to continue. Chris's voice grew quieter, as though the words themselves carried more weight than he could bear. "I can't keep lying. Not to them, not to myself, not to you. I'd rather risk everything than keep living like this." His hands trembled in his lap, his shoulders tense, as though bracing for the fallout of his own honesty. The moment stretched between them, heavy with tension, yet alive with something new. For the first time, there was no mask, no performance, only the raw truth Chris had hidden for years. Alex felt the urge to reach out, to offer some kind of anchor, but he stopped himself. He understood that sometimes the greatest act of support is restraint, the willingness to simply remain. So he stayed. He met Chris's trembling honesty with unwavering calm, not filling the silence with empty words, but holding it steady, letting Chris feel the weight of being accepted exactly as he was. Chris searched his face, almost disbelieving, waiting for condemnation that never came. Instead, he found presence, quiet and unshaken. And in that fragile space, something shifted. The fear didn't vanish, the struggle didn't resolve, but the air felt different. Chris was no longer carrying the secret alone. For the first time, he was allowed to exist without disguise, to breathe without the crushing pressure of performance. Alex gave him that space, not by demanding answers or promises, but by staying. The honesty of that moment was not neat or polished, not triumphant in the way stories often are. It was raw, broken, heavy with years of fear. Yet within it lay something powerful, the beginning of freedom, the faint flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth was survivable. Morning crept in slowly, pale light filtering through the gym's tall windows, washing the room in muted streaks that cut across empty racks and abandoned mats. Neither Alex nor Chris moved for a long while, both of them suspended in the fragile silence that followed Chris's confession. It was not the silence of avoidance this time, nor the silence of fear. It was something different, heavy still, but alive with possibility. For the first time in weeks, Chris wasn't hiding, and Alex wasn't left chasing after fragments of meaning. They were both here, present, unshielded by masks, breathing in the same truth. When they finally stood, there were no grand declarations, no promises carved into stone. They didn't need them. The moment itself had already drawn a line in the sand. Life would no longer be what it had been. The weight of that realization lingered between them as they left the gym side by side, the city outside humming with its indifferent rhythm. To the world, nothing looked different. But for them, everything had changed. The days that followed were not smooth. Alex quickly learned that honesty was not a shield against hardship, but a decision to face it head on. Chris still stumbled, still retreated into himself when fear gripped him too tightly. At the gym, he sometimes slipped back into old habits, keeping his headphones on, avoiding long conversations. But the difference was clear. The walls he built were no longer impenetrable. Cracks had formed, and through them Alex could glimpse the man beneath the mask. Little gestures replaced words when words felt too heavy. A protein shake left on a bench. No note, but unmistakably Chris's. A glance caught in the mirror that lingered just long enough to matter. A walk home at night where silence was no longer avoidance, but quiet understanding. These fragments built something fragile yet undeniable, a language of honesty spoken not through confessions alone, but through presence. Yet honesty had its price. Chris's phone would buzz with calls from home, his mother's name flashing across the screen, and Alex would see the way his entire body tensed, as though bracing for impact. Sometimes Chris answered, his voice carefully composed, each word spoken with the precision of someone still hiding pieces of himself. Other times he let the call ring until the sound itself became unbearable. Alex never pushed, but he never left either. He stayed beside him, a silent witness to the war Chris was fighting. One evening, sitting outside on a quiet street as the city pulsed around them, Chris's voice trembled as he admitted what Alex already knew. "They won't understand," he said, eyes fixed on the ground. "They'll see me as something broken, something wrong." His words carried the weight of every stereotype, every whisper of judgment that had haunted him. Alex listened, his chest tight, and answered simply, "Then let them. That doesn't change who you are." The statement was not grand or dramatic, but Chris's eyes flickered in a way that suggested it had landed somewhere deep. The hardest part was accepting that life would not suddenly become easy. There would still be looks, still be whispers, still be moments when Chris's fear might claw its way back to the surface. But in facing those moments together, they found a quiet strength neither had expected. They didn't need perfection, they needed truth. Weeks later, they sat on the fire escape of the gym, overlooking the glow of the city below. The night air was cool, the streets alive with distant sounds, but up there it felt still, almost detached from the chaos below. Chris passed Alex a bottle of water, their hands brushing briefly. This time, it wasn't accidental. It wasn't a slip of courage quickly retracted. It was deliberate. Small, simple, but deliberate. They didn't speak at first. Words felt unnecessary. Instead, they sat shoulder to shoulder, the hum of neon lights above them, the weight of the night pressing in. Chris finally broke the quiet, his voice rough but steady. "I'm tired of hiding." The words were not shouted, not wrapped in drama. They were spoken plainly, like a man laying down a burden. Alex didn't reply with speeches or promises. He only nodded, letting Chris know he had been heard. In that moment, Alex realized the real victory was not in changing the world around them, but in choosing to live honestly within it. Others would keep their masks, continue their performances, bend themselves into shapes that pleased everyone else. But not them. Not anymore. Their path would not be easy, but it would be real. And that, more than anything, was their triumph. The city lights flickered below, and for the first time in a long while, Chris didn't look away. He stayed. And in that staying, Alex understood. Hope was not found in grand gestures, but in the choice to stand in the open, unmasked, even when the world demanded silence.